Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to the School of Professional Studies Center for Global Affairs. Henceforth, I will refer to it only as CGA. This gorgeous room is not our usual home. Our home is in an equally beautiful historic building called the Woolworth Building. And for those of you who have not yet visited, I hope you'll have occasion to do so. We host events there starting this September all the way through April, and you will be receiving notices of those in a couple of weeks. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I hope you will get to know us better. Some of our alumni, our faculty, our current students, and our friends are in the audience among you. And you also have some propaganda literature in the back, which I usually do, but I won't bore you with all that. And those describe our academic and our public programs. We take really great pride in our graduate program, in our public events, in our non-degree programs, and above all, I would say, in building a community which is invested in thoughtful engagement with the world around them, people like you. I think you will all agree that there are few people able to generate as large an audience as yours tonight in the middle of summer. I believe that the last time we did that was in the summer of 2009 when we co-hosted an event with then Ambassador Susan Rice, who outlined US-UN policy. But we can actually count on a crowd like this when we are hosting Ian Bremmer and Dana Perino. You have probably seen their bios on the screen, but I want to provide just a little bit of background. Ian is a friend. You're probably familiar with his work at Eurasia and as a frequently called upon foreign policy expert. I assume you've read one or more of his books and many of his articles. He formed part of a panel of 9 in October 2012, a very provocative panel which tried to predict what the outcomes might be from that presidential election. Subsequently, he became associated with NYU, and we are always delighted to have him back with us. 3 years ago, I was present. He gave what I considered one of the most fantastic convocation speeches at our graduate convocation. It was a massive audience of students receiving their master's programs and their families. And I actually turned around and said, I'm going to depart from script because I have never heard a speech like this one. Dana Perino is someone whom I only know by reputation, but it is a very impressive one. And I was delighted to hear that she was able to join Ian in conversation tonight. She's the author most recently of And the Good News Is, which offers lessons from her impressive career in politics and media as former White House press secretary and current co-host of Fox News, The Five. I believe that we are in, with 2 such guests, for a very sparkling conversation. We're honored to have them here, and I'd like you to help me welcome them. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to kick it off. Thank you so much for having me at NYU. I was born in Wyoming, in Evanston, Wyoming. Probably many people here have probably been to Wyoming at some point, or if you haven't, you should schedule a trip. It is beautiful. And I came to New York 4 years ago. I never anticipated that I would live here. I grew up on a cattle ranch. It's quite different from the Black Hills of Wyoming. And my first year was pretty frantic. I did try to do everything. We went to every musical and every restaurant. We were frantic. The second year, I hated New York, and I wanted to leave. I didn't know if I would even sign a second contract to do the show. And then I was at a dinner on a Monday night. Here you are on a Monday night. Monday night, black tie, drizzle outside, freezing cold. I sit down, and Jared Cohen, who worked in the Bush and the Obama administrations, was sitting next to me, but I didn't recognize him, and he said, "Oh, don't you love New York?" And I said, "No, I don't." And then he said, "Well, I want you to love New York." And he was on this quest, so he invited me to a couple of things. He suggested that I get the New York Post because it's like the school newspaper, and you have to read it in order to understand New York. So I started doing these things, and then I got invited to a conference where I met Ian and his wife, Anne. And in my 4th year of New York, I have to say, you've totally won me over. I really love it. And Ian and Anne are a big part of that. As are Joan McNaughton is there in the front row, and her husband is Paul Morrow. He's on his way. He serves with the NYPD, so I'm sure there's probably a good reason that he is not here, and it's probably not traffic. So I was honored to be asked to be here because getting to know Ian and following him on the Twitter, which I love to do, has been wonderful. So I am going to spend about an hour grilling him with the hardest questions he's ever had. And then we're going to give it over to you and take as many questions as we can and try to get you out of here on time at 8:30. Is there any opening remarks you want to give? No? Are you shy?
No.
Are you nervous?
I'm excited.
I am excited too. I'm really honored to be here.
The first time we've done anything public, it's kind of fun. You know, we always do private stuff. It's good to do public stuff.
Well, let's be clear. Not that kind of private stuff, but
Yeah.
we have been, we are good friends. I'm kidding. I told Ian that I have to be his press secretary too. Okay, I'm going to start off with, I just left The Five. And that's a show from 5 to 6 on Fox. And we don't usually have guests, but we have started having some of the presidential candidates on the show. So Governor Mike Huckabee joined us today. And he obviously he has not been in the news for about 6 months until Sunday, when he made a comment that I questioned him on today. And Geraldo Rivera was on our show today as a guest, and he offered an opportunity and called upon Mike Huckabee to apologize for the comment about President Obama wanting to march Israelis into the ovens because of the Iran deal. And the governor did not back down. In fact, he doubled down, I would say. And I wondered if you could just comment on this development. I do think that it probably works against his ultimate goal if it was to try to derail the Iran deal.
I think that Governor Huckabee might be my 16th least favorite candidate on the Republican side.
And that's saying something.
And it is. No, I think I'd go Trump before I went Huckabee. I think I would.
Wow.
Well, no, I think Huckabee's views are more corrosive, honestly. I think Trump, were he to become president, I don't think there's any danger of that, but were it to happen, right, would be much more flexible in his policy views. I was a little stunned, and it takes a lot to stun me, especially in an American campaign. But the idea that he would really, sort of evoke the Holocaust and effectively equate the president with Hitler.
Mm-hmm. He would say Chamberlain.
He would.
No, I mean, he's splitting hairs. That's what he would say.
He would say that. But I also don't think he's going to take a particular hit on it. Jeb Bush did come out and say he shouldn't have said that. There are other candidates who will not say that. I feel fairly confident. And it's because, number one, when you've got 16 candidates, I think everybody wants to sort of make a bit of a mark, and we are talking about them. It's the first thing you raised. Morning Joe this morning, first thing they raised when I was, so both sides, right on the left.
And Huckabee says that he has received a lot of, well, not just attention, but support and calls of gratitude from some in the Jewish community. Just that's his point of view. That's what he's saying.
So I think the Jewish community is pretty split on this issue. I'm saying that I'm not a member of it, but maybe honorary, I don't know. But I'm Nebuchadnezzar, right? So I've got that. And I like New York, so, there's a little bit. But
then do I qualify?
Yeah, Iran's from Iran. It's the same sort of thing. When I think about the reaction of the Jewish community in the U.S. to Netanyahu, I would say it's pretty divided. And I will tell you that Netanyahu does not in any way reflect a united view in Israel of the Iran deal. I was with a very, thank you. I was with 5 people agree. I was with a senior Israeli official last week, and who basically told me that he recognized that over the long term, this deal would be better for the Israelis than the present geopolitical trajectory of the Middle East. Doesn't like the nuclear deal itself, but recognizes the geopolitics are likely to improve. And furthermore, recognizes that it would be the absolute worst thing for Israel and for Netanyahu if the Israelis were to effectively push Congress to vote down the deal now that it's been agreed with the P5+1. But he also said that if he were to say that publicly, his next appointment would be Abuja.
It's nice there.
I said that. Yeah, I think it is nice there. But he doesn't want to go there.
I see.
So no, I think it's a problem, and I don't know how one reacts to that kind of a statement other than to condemn it. And Obama obviously did that fairly effectively in Ethiopia today. But I mean, if you want to get into Iran, I do think that there are real arguments both in favor and against the deal.
Well, that was my next question, which is, as I understand it, you think the deal is a real gamble, but in the long run, a net plus.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Want to explain yourself?
Sure. No, I think the deal is a real gamble. So I have to say, so I went to see Kerry at the Council of Foreign Relations on Friday morning. I was very impressed with him there. I have not been very impressed with Kerry on many things in the Middle East since he's become Secretary of State. He has spent the better part of the last 3 months of his life doing nothing but this deal. Mm-hmm. And he has therefore become incredibly technically expert at it. And his ability to respond to questions from people that have not read the deal, particularly in Congress, who really have no sense of the deal, but some are ideologically opposed, mm-hmm. he really schools them, mm-hmm. right? That does not mean it's a good deal. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at, so for example, the fact that the Iranians have 24 days to respond to whether or not they're going to let the Americans into a site, and then there's a back and forth around that, that is clearly very far from anytime, anywhere, which the White House has now said was a rhetorical assertion, but not what we really meant. Now they're saying that, well, we'll be able to see any signature of any nuclear enrichment that was done on that site. Possibly true. Some experts disagree with that. But I'll tell you that we won't have any idea of any military research they're doing on weaponization of nuclear capacity. Mm-hmm. And that's also the nature of these 2 secret protocols that were signed by the IAEA. And so there are problems with the nuclear deal that they haven't really responded to. And I asked this morning, I pressed the Energy Secretary, Moniz, on this specifically, and he assertively dodged that question. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give the nuclear side of this deal a 3. I don't think it's very good. And I think implementation is going to be hard because the Russians want to sell weapons to the Iranians, the Chinese want to buy energy from the Iranians, the Europeans want to trade with the Iranians, and we're trying to uphold the deal. I think that's going to be hard. But
wasn't that also the point?
Yep.
But the geopolitics is good.
But the geopolitics are good.
Does that outweigh the nuclear deal?
Yeah, I think it probably does. I mean, first of all, that's a real question. Does it outweigh the nuclear deal? I would say it was going to be. I think if we had stuck around and pressed longer, because the Iranians certainly knew they were never going to get a better deal than under Obama-Kerry. And that means not only signing the deal, but implementing. So it means T-minus 8 months of when Obama's out. So I think that as the time goes on, our ability to press the Iranians was going to go up somewhat if we were willing to put the extra work in and be patient, go through some more deadlines. There wasn't that much patience. A lot of time was spent.
Can I ask you a political question
Yeah,
then,
sure.
though? Going just back to toggle back to the 2016
Yeah.
election here. So there are some Republican candidates who immediately said, I would repudiate the deal on the first day, which to me sounded very rash.
Yes.
And impossible.
Yes.
Then you have a Jeb Bush who says, well, I wouldn't even have my cabinet confirmed on the first day, so let's be thoughtful, let's think this through. And he's getting hammered for being reasonable. And I don't know that in a presidential election, at least in the Republican primary, reasonable can win.
So you like Jeb's position? I'm
just saying I thought that was smart and reasonable, and that's not typically what you're getting out of others.
Okay. I'm not shocked by that, but nonetheless,
Okay.
just give me a hard time. So,
You too.
You're going to give me a hard time. You're going to give me a hard time soon, so I know it's coming. look, I clearly I agree with this, but I also think it's hard when the Obama administration was saying all the way through, you can't criticize the negotiations because you don't know what's in the deal yet. So you can't criticize the deal until we know what's in the deal. And then as soon as we know what's in the deal, then you can't criticize the deal because everyone's already signed it, and it'll be a disaster if we pull out when everybody else is there. Well, what was there like? Was there one existential moment when it was possible for us to sign the deal? Could they have called us then and said, okay, we're all opposed?
And
That
also,
was gonna be
why
hard.
go to the UN Security Council before going to Congress? Because Senator Corker of Tennessee took a gamble and a risk politically to help President Obama to try to give them more time in April with the understanding and agreement and the word from the White House saying, we promise we will let you go first before we go to the UN Security Council. And that evaporated on the first day.
It is not clear to me that we want Congress playing a large role in foreign policy generally. I mean, irrespective of the nature
But they
and
have
composition
a constitutional role.
No, well, I mean, it's not clear given that this isn't a treaty. They have a constitutional role certainly in terms of...
Okay, but why would the White House have said that in the first place then?
Well, again, because some of the sanctions that have been put in place have been put in place in Congress. And so you can negotiate with the Iranians, you can cut a deal, but the sanctions are still going to be there. The executive actions will not be, but the executive orders, but the sanctions will be. So I think he was a bit snookered. But keep in mind, we go back to bringing in Congress. Obama's decision, red line, no red line. Well, only red line if they use chemical weapons a lot in Syria, but let's ask the Brits and the French if they want to engage, and then we're going to ask Congress. No, we're not. The Russians will help us. That was not the way to engage Congress, right? So I think we've been playing a little fast and loose with congressional involvement in foreign policy, generally speaking, and they haven't been enormously productive. But on Iran, as much as I am annoyed by all of these things, I do think it's a win. I mean, it's obviously a win because we've been working multilateral diplomacy for a long time, and we don't want to be seen as failing at it. So that matters. But it's also a win. You're not buying that. That's
no.
fair. Well, no, but let's put it this
Nice
way.
try.
No, it's a serious effort. It's a serious effort, and I mean, once you've brought
But like, what
the
does that
Europeans
mean? You get what?
you get
Respect?
You get credibility in building an international coalition to put sanctions together, leading over the course of many years, forcing the Iranians to the table and bringing that to fruition, as opposed to having it fall apart. It is useful for Americans to have diplomatic leverage over our allies, for example, in showing that we can lead a process. But more importantly than that, you asked the question, am I worried about the nuclear side? I am vastly more concerned about Iran's cyber capabilities in launching a war, say, against the Saudis than I am about their nuclear capabilities, and no one's even discussed that. So that wasn't even on the table. Not the Republicans, not the Democrats. Haven't heard one Republican candidate mention it. Haven't heard the Democrats mention it. I also think oil prices, we're going to have 1 million plus barrels of additional oil on the market in the next 18 months when the Iranian deal comes online. Oil prices come down, hurts the Saudis, hurts the Russians, hurts the Venezuelans, helps America. That seems like a geopolitical plus. I like the fact that the Saudis have had to publicly say that they are studying the deal, they don't oppose it. I love the fact that
Can I stop you there?
Yep.
It was reported on Friday that the Saudis met with Hamas.
Yep.
So has the real, don't you think it's possible that the Saudis understand that they have to say we are studying the deal, but the realignment of the region has begun behind the scenes?
Yes, it has. And in addition to meeting Hamas, the Saudis have also actually detained over 400 members in Saudi Arabia that they say are part of ISIS, which they did right after the deal was struck. They weren't doing that beforehand. I don't think that's coincidence. I think the Saudis understand they're in a much more difficult geopolitical position.
And you think that's good?
I think it's good for America. I'm not sure it's good for everybody. I mean, good requires an indirect and direct object, right? I mean, there's no like kind of existential good, right? I mean, we're going to have cheaper oil, so that's bad for climate, but it's good for the American economy, right? I mean, I don't know, but it definitely, would we rather have like Iran, which is supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and Assad, or we rather have the Saudis who are supporting clerics who have been proselytizing Wahhabist ideology that was ultimately behind the growth of ISIS and Al-Qaeda? That's a tough one for me, but on balance, I kind of like the fact that the Iranians are likely to be more globalizers and that opening their economy, which is vastly more diverse than the Saudi economy, means that they probably will be more closely aligned with the Americans within 10 years than the Saudis will be. I'd probably make that bet.
Okay, you brought up ISIS. I want to go to that, but because this morning in your note, you talk about Turkey. And we could spend an hour and a half on ISIS. I don't necessarily want to do that, but I did want to ask you about this two main things. One is the developments in Turkey and how important those are and where you think that's going. And the second piece is something you also referenced today, which also is important to Turkey, which is we currently have more refugees in the world, 2 million refugees, than we did in World War II. And the strain that that is putting on a lot of the countries in the Middle East. And where is the UN? Where is the United States? What are we doing to help them?
My God, the second question is clearly the most urgent one, right? 2 million refugees in Turkey. And they're spending, my understanding is about 95% of the financial costs of hosting those refugees being borne on the Turkish government. Right. And I saw Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, with a young Palestinian girl last week who was crying, wanting to know why she couldn't stay, and Merkel hugged her and said, sorry. And I would have been much more public in my opposition to Merkel if it wasn't for the fact that the Germans are doing a lot more than the Americans are. And you know, I mean, Trump talks about the fact that he wants to build walls. You know, actually, we've got things called oceans, which are actually much more useful than walls because the Syrians can't swim here. And that means that there is not a single candidate on the Democratic or Republican side that feels that there's some problem with the fact that thus far we've accepted fewer than 1,000 Syrian refugees out of 4 million. It implies that there is no Statue of Liberty. It doesn't matter. Our values are irrelevant. And I have a serious problem with that. So I don't know where the U.S. is. The UN is ineffectual on this issue because the UN, of course, ultimately big decisions would have to be made by the Security Council, and everyone will either veto or prevent. Certainly there are lots of organizations within the broader UN structure that are doing an awful lot. The World Food Organization, which, you know, it was providing a food program, providing some, I believe it was some 80% of all the food that was going to the refugees to support in the Syrian camps as they existed, but they were running out of cash as well. And at the end of the year last year, there was 2 weeks' time when they just ran out because there weren't not enough money being provided by the international lenders. This is a serious problem. No one seems to care, and I think that we now have 4 failed states in the Middle East. We have, as you say, the highest numbers of refugees since World War II, and I do not see countries stepping up. I see the Greeks and the Italians hosting vastly more refugees than other states in Europe. And they're, of course, countries that economically are not exactly in the position to do the most.
And now, so Turkey is drawn in to the conflict with and allowing more U.S. Use of its bases. Do you think that that will get us to at least maybe not a solution, but it helps?
I think so. It's interesting. I mean, for a long time, people were asking, you know, the Bush administration, for example, how can you be fighting both Iran and Iraq? Right? And so today we can be asking the Turks, how can you be fighting Assad, ISIS, and the Kurds? Right? I mean, Turkey's new strategy in the region is we are fighting everyone. Right? And that is only a workable strategy if you don't intend to fight any of them very much.
Right.
And that is precisely Turkey's strategy.
Is that, so earlier today, if you don't follow Ian on Twitter, I recommend you do. You tweeted a map. And you said, good luck with that, this is what you were talking about?
I was talking about the small area that is meant to be the safe zone in Syria between the Syrian and Turkish border that the Americans and the Turks are saying we want to make into a safe zone. But we are not going to send ground troops into Syria. The Turks might do some special forces raids, but they're not going to spend ground forces into Syria. We are not going, we've been saying Assad must go, but we've not actually said that who's going to make Assad go. That no one's going to make Assad go. He
said today his army is tired.
Assad. Mm-hmm. He did say that, and I suspect they are. I think he's had a lot to do with that. But you know, the fact is that the fight that now the Turks are getting into and allowing us to use their air base at Incirlik, allowing us to overfly, that's largely going to be to fight ISIS. And we've had about, I think, roughly 10% of the airstrikes that we've done in Iraq, we've been doing in Syria. And those airstrikes, of course, are vastly less than we have been engaging in other major wars that we've fought over the past 20, 30 years. I see there is absolutely a strategy to contain ISIS. There is absolutely a strategy to kick the can to the next administration. There is not a strategy to destroy ISIS. And it's not clear to me that most Americans would support a strategy to destroy ISIS. Certainly, I mean, I see Pataki come out and say he'd support 10,000 troops on the ground in Iraq. I haven't heard a serious strategy from Pataki. I've heard Lindsey Graham, who I think is very smart on foreign policy issues, say if you don't want war, don't vote for me. I think most Americans will heed that call and not vote for him. Yeah, I think that this Turkey thing does absolutely align the Turks a little bit more with the Americans on this very specific issue. It's really not a game changer in the region.
Okay, I'm going to take you to 3 other regions before I turn to a grilling about your book.
Okay.
And just as a tease, when I finished Ian's book, which I read diligently, I screamed. And so that's a tease for sticking around.
Did you actually scream?
I actually screamed.
That's
and I almost
horrifying.
threw it against the wall.
Wow.
So we are going to have a good conversation about that. Can I take you to Russia for a moment? Because I feel like Putin is skating under the radar, doing all sorts of bad, nefarious things, and we're not paying attention. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. They actually took more territory in Georgia in the last few days because, they got the hand in Ukraine, and then Georgia's down here, right? So
Right.
don't watch Georgia. He's not in a great position, right? I mean, Russia's not exactly, sort of ascendant today. Their economy is going to contract by 3 or 4% this year. It'll be purely on the backs of the consumers. He has an 85% approval rating, which is real, but it's purely because he's been, sort of trying to demonize the United States and whipping up a lot of national sentiment over this Ukraine thing. It's not like Ukraine is a territory people are really diving all over themselves to have a piece of. When the former Ukrainian president begged the Germans for support so that they wouldn't be forced into the Eurasian Union that the Russians run, the European response and the German response was harder line than their response to Greece.
Why?
Which is saying something.
Why is that?
Not a part of the EU, and very corrupt, big expense. Why would you bother? And then suddenly, the former president, right, goes to Yanukovych goes to Sochi. He gets support from Putin. He gets a lot of money from Putin. In fact, they promised even before that I think it was $15 billion in credit. And then only after the Russians said, okay, we'll bail you out and you'll have to join the Eurasian Union, and then there are demonstrations in Ukraine, then suddenly we're like, oh, Ukraine.
Right.
And
it's
I think we really, I got to tell you, I mean, we've had some comparatively big wins in foreign policy in the last few months. We got Cuba, we got Trade Promotion Authority, and though Iran is very controversial, I would consider Iran a win. We've had some disasters too, and Russia's the biggest disaster in my view. And you can't, I mean, if you had told the Obama administration that as a result of your policy, 6,000 Ukrainians will die, 100,000 plus will be refugees, the economy will be in free fall, the Russians won't move a damn, the Europeans will move away from you on sanctions, you will drive the Russians towards China. A year and a half later, do you still want that policy? Today, most people I know in the administration want to back away from that policy. They're trying to find a way to normalize with Russia, given that we failed. And I think that the people we failed the most are the Ukrainians, because if I were a billionaire chocolate oligarch, as Poroshenko is, who had never been in politics before, and suddenly I'm made president of Ukraine, and I don't know what the hell's going on. And the Americans come in and they say, we support you, and we're going to isolate the Russians, and we have a Twitter campaign, and we send the head of the CIA to visit me in Kiev, and we send the vice president, and we send the secretary of state, and then we invite me to the NATO summit, which, I mean, okay, we're not going to let me join, but I get to see what it's like. I could be forgiven for believing that if I fought a little harder against the Russians, that the Americans were actually going to support me. We shouldn't do stuff like that.
If I get this right, are you saying that a billionaire who's a businessman might have a hard time slipping right into being the leader of a country? I have that right.
I'm saying exactly that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to make it clear. I'm not going to say it publicly because I don't need the.
But you don't like Trump.
Who?
Yeah.
Who?
I've seen this happen.
Okay, China. You brought up China. Okay, there's so much to talk about with China, but can I focus on one thing? Because you said you were more worried about Iran's capability in its cyber war.
Can we get to Trump in the bonus round, though, at least?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah.
You can talk about him all you want.
Okay.
Okay, China. Iran, cyber war,
Yeah.
China. Okay, so in the last 2 weeks, and I have a personal interest in this, we find out that the Chinese, for about a 6-month period, are hacking into the Office of Personnel Management computers, where anybody who has ever had a top secret clearance background check, even if you didn't get the job, and the FBI tells you when you go through these checks, they say, whatever you do, don't lie. Because we'll find your neighbor or somebody who reveals that you were lying. So you tell them everything. Thankfully, I didn't have that much to tell. But we know that the Chinese now have all of that information of 30 million Americans. And we say nothing publicly. In fact, the administration let it out on background that we're not going to name the Chinese publicly. Like, what is the state of our relationship when it comes to China on so many levels, but in particular on this one?
Well, so this one's interesting. I think it's 22 million. Maybe it's gotten to 30. But still, that's pretty bad. I accept that. And clearly, China's cyber capabilities are very advanced. They've spent a lot of money on it. And they've gotten pretty close to our capabilities in a lot of areas. They do slightly different things than we do. We used to think they did radically different things than we do. With Snowden, we found out that actually the space between the operating capabilities as well as execution, not so different. The big difference between China and the United States on the cyber side is that when we collect information internationally, we don't tend to give it to most of our companies to support them for profitability. We're not state capitalist, and so, I mean, when we go and hack Petrobras, which we've done in Brazil, we don't give it to ExxonMobil and Chevron and say, here, guys, this will help you do a better deal. If we had, they would have clearly done much better in that country than they have been recently, right? Where the Chinese actively do go into Alcoa, they'll go into Westinghouse, they'll go into US Steel, they'll steal the information, they'll give it directly to the companies. Of course, those companies are owned by the Chinese government. And we do steal things and help the US trade representative advantage Americans in terms of the trade deals we're trying to negotiate on behalf of our companies. So it's more indirect, but there is a difference there, and I accept that. But I think I'm going to answer this not in the way you expect.
Okay.
Because, you see, the only thing that makes me somewhat comfortable about the fact that the Chinese have hacked all this information is I feel fairly certain that we have exactly the same information on all of China's spies. Because we certainly engage...
But I'm not a spy.
No. And on all of the people in China that have clearances. I feel fairly certain we have that information. I'm like, if we are engaging... I don't know, but I didn't know that we were doing mass collection of all of Americans' phone calls beforehand, right? So, and I think that I don't want to know. I don't want it to be public information about exactly what we're taking from the Chinese. But what I do know is that we are not going to be comfortable with parity. We were never comfortable with parity during the Cold War with the Soviets. We really felt like we deserved and had to have an advantage versus them, and we're going to feel the same way about the Chinese. It's going to discomfort us greatly that the Chinese are not just going to become the largest economy in the world, but on issues like cyber, they're going to have the same level of vulnerability to us as we have to them. We're not going to like that. Right. We're not going to like that.
One last region, Europe. Do you watch financial markets in Europe with hope or horror?
I watch financial markets in Europe with hope. I watch the political environment in Europe with horror.
Mm-hmm. And how worried should we be? Should Americans worry or care about that Greece leave? If Greece were to leave the euro, does it matter?
In the short term, I mean, the worst that Europe does, certainly if they fall apart and they go back into recession, that'll have a negative knock-on effect on the American economy because of trade. On the other hand, if Europe seems really vulnerable and slow and non-productive, the US dollar is a much greater, you want to invest here, you want to buy our real estate, you don't want to be in Europe. So, I mean, we're last resort and we're comparatively stable. What worries me about Europe is the fact that when we came out of World War II, it was the transatlantic relationship that really allowed us to create the world order. It was the transatlantic relationship and the Marshall Plan that was the backbone for the IMF and the United Nations and the Bretton Woods Accord on currency and the World Trade Organization. And I would argue that right now the transatlantic relationship is at its weakest at any point in the last several decades. I think in part that's true because we're more unilateral and a little more inward focused. It's the energy revolution, the food revolution. It's the backlash from trillion-dollar wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have not gone well for us. It's that kind of stuff. But I also think it's really Europe falling apart. And Europe is not just about the European Union and its parliament and its central bank. Fundamentally, you don't fight for institutions. You fight for the belief in ideals. And the European ideal was common economic, political values, and a social contract. The idea that ultimately the Europeans wouldn't go to war with each other because they had so much in common, they'd look after each other. And what I have seen transpire in Europe over the past several years, and particularly transpire between the Germans and the Greeks over the past year, has been a level of mutual acrimony and misunderstanding that really approaches the level of Israel versus Palestine. And that is so depressing to me. It's so depressing to me that ultimately there was no appreciation whatsoever on either side of needing to build something that would be sustainable. And yes, I guess I blame the Germans a little more for this, in the sense that the absence of willingness to engage in debt forgiveness was just not a part of the vocabulary, and still doesn't appear to be. And I think that's horrifying.
I just want to take you one last region with a quick comment about Africa, because near and dear to my heart. I worked for a president that did a lot there. I traveled there myself and had a chance to do some volunteer work there, and I've stayed pretty active. President Obama is there as we speak. Hopeful about Africa or not?
I mean, it's hard not to be hopeful when you see the reduction in poverty we've had in Africa, when you see the urbanization levels, the education of women, the improvement in life expectancy, the health care. I mean, on every basic human indicator, Africa looks really good. You don't like the terrorism direction, of course. But I'll tell you, I can't be super optimistic about Africa because when I think about climate change, I think that the region in the world that's going to be most hit by extreme events is going to be sub-Saharan Africa, and I don't think they have the infrastructure or the governance to deal with it. When I see the impact of terrorism and the displacement, the forcible displacement of human beings, the migrations that I see, I see Africa going to get hit worse than anybody else, and I see extreme radical Islam, and I see extreme radical Christianity, and I see it in the Horn of Africa, I see it in West Africa, I see incredibly poor governance in South Africa, I see it in North Africa. There are countries in Africa that are getting it right that will do incredibly well over the coming decades, and I think Kenya, where Obama just visited, is number one on that list. And I think Ethiopia, where Obama is today, is very high on that list. I think Ghana is high on the list. I think Uganda is high on that list. But I would not in any way put a majority of African countries on that list. And I think that the extremes between the high performers and the low performers in Africa are going to become vastly more extreme than what you see now among the BRICS or among the major emerging markets in the world. And that does concern me.
All right, we're going to turn to your book. Okay, it's called Superpower. I see some of you have copies of it there. It's a bestseller. It was highly anticipated. Can you explain in a nutshell the premise of the book?
The premise is the idea that over the last 25 years, the United States has really not had a foreign policy strategy. It's largely been risk averse, it's largely been reactive. That's gotten more problematic over time. And that while that's been happening, we now have not just a vacuum in global leadership internationally, but more importantly, we do have one country in the world that does have a global strategy, and it's China. It's not us. They're spending over $1 trillion, and they are trying to align countries with Chinese standards, internet, Chinese currency, while the Americans don't actually have a reaction to it. And I think that if you ask me, over the last 25 years, you and I may disagree on this, I think the greatest damage that's been done to the United States over the last 25 years was the extraordinary overreaction to 9/11. I think that, in other words, we did it to ourselves. But the good thing about overreacting to 9/11 was, at least at the time, the U.S. economy was in very good shape, and the Russians were largely supportive of us and weak. The Chinese were pretty small, and the Europeans were with us, and the alignment was good. It's very clear that we're going to continue to overreact to stuff. I mean, one American gets, sort of beheaded in the Middle East, and we go nuts. Ebola, 2 people come to the U.S. with Ebola, we go crazy. I'm very worried about what's going to happen. I mean, Trump is ahead in the polls, and we go, oh my God, he's going to be president. You give me a break. $5 billion 18 months later in the election, then we can have a conversation. You know, it's a little early. And I think that what worries me is that, I don't know if it's in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but at some point we're going to have another 9/11. It might not be terrorism, it might be climate, it might be cyber, it might be bio, it might be anything, right? It could be a SARS type thing. But whatever it is, the idea that the next time we massively overreact to a big crisis will be when China is the largest economy in the world and the Europeans are fragmented and the relationship isn't what it was, and Russia desperately wants us to fail, and Putin at this point is feeling a little bit desperate. If we screw that up, that's going to hurt us. It's going to hurt our kids. We can't afford one of those. So the purpose of this book was to say, we've been in a position where not only we didn't have to do much, but we could massively overreact and we were still okay. Mm-hmm. We actually, going forward, we really need to have a strategy. And so it really outlined what I thought possible strategies for America would be for this 2016 election, where we're clearly going to talk a lot more about foreign policy than we did, Lord knows, in 2012, where it was a big nothing burger.
So you say that there are three possible paths.
Yeah.
One is being indispensable America. The other one's called Moneyball, and the third one is independent America. Let me ask you, before I ask you to talk a little bit about your conclusion, why do we have to choose one of those? One of the things, I'm reading the book and I'm reading along, and I emailed Ian, I'm like, do I have to choose? Like, I really have to choose one of these? It's not like an a la carte menu where I could take a little bit of Moneyball here and a little bit. And you say, no, you have to choose.
Yes.
Why?
I do. I do think we have to choose. And I don't think, by the way, by choosing, that doesn't mean that suddenly that is the way you respond to any crisis and you have a playbook and so something happens and this is what you're going to do. Not at all. But I think in the same way that, like, if you were running a corporation, you need to stand for something. You need to have a mission statement. Something like your shareholders get and they say, oh, that's what you're doing. Something where your competitors are like, oh, that's what they're all about. And countries need this too. Americans need something to stand for. We need to understand, do our values matter or not? Do we stand for democracy or not? Are we really going to promote our values internationally or not? Do we care about the Middle East? Are we going to fight terrorism? Do we want a leadership role? Does NATO matter to us? And it doesn't just matter to us, it really matters to our allies. When I go around the world, I'm so unnerved by the fact that I've met with just about every foreign minister from every major ally we have in the world in the last year, and several heads of state. And I'm stunned by every one of them. It's Canada, it's Mexico, it's Singapore, it's Japan, it's Israel, it's Britain, it's France, it's Germany, every one of them. And they say, what do you guys stand for? Can we count on you? Because if you have a relationship with someone important, an ally, a spouse, a child, and they know you really, really well, and suddenly something happens, and the relationship is different, you say, what's up? And they say, oh, nothing. And then, but it keeps happening, and you go, we got to sit down, let's talk. Come on, tell me. Nothing. Not only do you know they're lying, but you presume it's the worst possible thing. It's cancer. It's an affair. It's God, it's a drug addiction, whatever it is, right? And that's precisely the way our allies increasingly feel. And they're hedging. They're changing their behavior. The Gulf allies don't come to a summit on security when Obama invites them. Netanyahu comes to Washington when Obama tells them not to. The Brits, our strategic partners, our special relationship, we tell them don't join the China-led AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. They become founding members. They say, why would we listen to you? The Turks, the NATO ally, they buy missile equipment from the Chinese. The Dutch, they buy their internet backbone from Huawei. This stuff is insane. These are allies of the United States. I don't think we want that kind of relationship. We don't want all of our allies to become frenemies. We don't want them all hedging. We need a strategy. So yeah, I do think we actually need a strategy. We need a leader that articulates that strategy.
Okay, so can we talk about why I screamed?
Sure.
We can talk about the end of the book.
Sure. Okay,
because you have the book. Presumably you've read it, and if you haven't, you could already flip through and you could have seen it. But that would be cheating. But I read the whole thing, and I got to the end. And so I grew up Wyoming, 1980s. Right? My first political memory is Reagan's inauguration. I love him. I worked for Republicans all my life. I end up working as the first Republican woman to be press secretary. So I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, I start the book thinking, I am definitely indispensable America, meaning America does what it takes, it stands for its values, it fights for freedom, it helps other people. Yeah, and we spend the money required to do it because it's in our best interest, and it helps others. That's what we do. Then I'm reading along, I'm like, the Moneyball thing makes kind of a lot of sense, because you want to make your decisions in your economic interests, and that ultimately probably helps your national security piece. Then the independent one, I think, oh, I could take a little bit from that too, where you think, you know what, I'm tired of fighting everybody else's issues, and why should I do this if all my frenemies are going to do whatever. But I finished the book, and I'm like, you know what, I am indispensable. That's where I come down. And maybe that's partly because I am an idealist and an optimist, and I don't have any real power. I just talk for an hour every day. And I get to the end, and you make a conclusion, and you say you owed it to your readers to come to a conclusion. And it was?
Independent.
And I screamed.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it.
I hated it.
Why? Okay, so you hated it?
I hated it.
That makes me feel so much better.
Of course.
Because I really like you.
No, but Dana,
How do you get to that independent?
No, but I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, I grew up, okay, I didn't grow up in Wyoming, and I don't have a party affiliation, and I'm a guy. I'm just going through the differences here, right? My hair's crap. I mean, you know, it's just, there's a lot going on here. But it is. Don't laugh, you know, right? But you know, I grew up. My first trip outside the United States in 1986 was to the Soviet Union.
I didn't know that.
And this was Gorbachev had just become the general secretary, and you know, I went not just to Leningrad and Moscow, but I went to different republics. I went to Armenia and Georgia. I went to Azerbaijan. Later, a few years later, I went to a bunch of other republics as well. And I saw all of these people, these captive nations of the Eastern Bloc, and they desperately supported American values. They wanted out. They wanted the free market and capitalism. They wanted democracy and liberty. They wanted rule of law. They wanted an independent judiciary. And we had Radio Free Europe. And we had Voice of America. And we had stuff, right? We had stores where you could buy things. And I grew up in the projects, but my life was radically better than theirs were. Mm-hmm. And so I really supported the notion that we didn't defeat the Soviets through the arms race. We defeated the Soviets with the power of our ideas and our values that we stood up for. And my God, what a wonderful thing to grow up in a country like that. Mm-hmm. So of course, indispensable is what I want. And then I started a company. And I see how like America is so entrepreneurial, and our companies do better than any other companies around the world, and they're world changing. And we really harness all of this intelligence that we have, and we do it, you know, just by ensuring that we're returning value to shareholders. That profit motivation is so extraordinary. So Moneyball really appeals to what I've spent the last 18 years of my life, you know, sort of developing. It kind of appeals to my wallet. And so why would I possibly go with independent, which I hate? And there are two reasons. And I really didn't want to even say. And when I wrote the book, I didn't actually know which one I was going to say I supported at the end. Mm-hmm. But when I finished it, I did know. And there were two reasons. The first reason is because when I look at the environment, the global environment today, and I see China getting stronger, and I see Europe fragmenting, and I see Russia going its own way, and I see that emerging markets are becoming the driver of global growth who don't necessarily share the values that we have. When I see that the largest economy in the world, when it becomes the largest economy, will still be authoritarian, will still be state capitalist, what I see is that if we don't choose fast, the gravity of the global order is going to move us more towards independent. And I am not one to fool myself. I can write a book, but that isn't going to allow me to pretend that our leaders are all going to read that book and say, yes, I'm going to really do indispensable now. And so if the most likely thing happens, which is we have another election where we pay more attention to foreign policy, but not enough, and we continue to kick the can down the road, that in 10 years and 20 years' time, when someone picks that book up, or God forbid, hopefully I'm still around and I'm still talking about this stuff, and they say, Ian, you said independent America 20 years ago, and you were right. So, I mean, analytically, I think we're going to be moving in that direction.
Does it matter, but does independent lead us to not being a superpower?
So second
sorry.
point. No, but the second reason I want to answer that because I worry about that. The second point is that when I look at the leaders that I see today, and maybe you have a different view, when I look at the ones running for president on both sides,
the same.
and I see everyone wrapping themselves in the flag, and a lot of people talking indispensable, and a few talking Moneyball,
And one talking independent.
and maybe two talking independent, maybe three. I can't tell with Trump, but no, I mean,
It depends.
Bernie a little, Rand a little. But, I'm not convinced. I'm convinced that a lot of them are going to talk the talk. I'm not convinced that they're going to walk the walk. And so, to a sense, my book is really a bit of a challenge to these leaders saying, I don't know who I'm going to vote for yet. I don't know how many of you know you're going to vote for. But I really would love one of them to stand up and convince me that I should vote for a different one because they're truly going to embrace it and they're going to lead. I don't expect that's going to happen. But I would like it to happen. And I do promise you, Dana, that I really think that 99% of this book is not about me telling you I like independent. I care less. I'm just
Right.
one person who writes or one person who talks. What it's really about is trying to get an audience like this who would come out on a Monday night
In the
to
summer.
talk with us about policy and the world to start having these conversations at the house with your kids, with your friends, with your colleagues, with your coworkers, because we matter. All of us matter. And if we can have a smarter conversation about America's role in the world because of something we're talking about today, that would, whether or not you end up coming out with independent, I care less what you come out with. I want you to have the debate.
Can
I
you
want this kind of debate.
answer that question about
Yeah.
if, let's say Bernie Sanders becomes president, and we go to independent America, over 10 to 20 years, does that lead us to not being a superpower, and is that okay?
So I think that to the extent that we are or are not a superpower in 20 years' time will have more to do with whether we choose one of these three routes or abdicate. I think the fastest route to not becoming a superpower is not choosing a route.
Okay.
I think that choosing independent, we're still very much a superpower because independent is still leading. It's leading by example. It's saying, you know what, we're not going to take fewer than 1,000 Syrians. We're going to take 50,000. We're going to take 100,000, and we're going to integrate them. And we're going to take smart ones, and we're going to engage them because that's the way our country's great. And you know what? We're not going to contain the Chinese. We're going to welcome their investment because ultimately the U.S. is the biggest too big to fail. It's not our banks. It's America. And every Chinese worth anything wants their kids to go to NYU and want to buy an apartment in this or other universities, but in America. And well, I think NYU, or wants to have real estate in this country, wants to put their money here. Why? Because it's so much more stable, sustainable. I want them to be so invested in what we're doing that they recognize that they're going to actually change their way of doing business, not because we've told them to, but because they're smart enough to recognize that we actually get some of this stuff right.
Okay.
So no, I think if we do independent correctly, we're still a superpower. But I also believe if we do indispensable or Moneyball correctly, we're still a superpower. I just think that we are less likely to do those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on because I think we're going to get to questions fairly soon, right, Alice? But I have a few minutes. Okay. Can I ask you, this is something I wanted to ask you. You advise a lot of world leaders and companies. And I'm curious, what is the most common thing that keeps them up at night versus what might keep Americans up at night? Like, where's the disparity, right? Because there was a recent Gallup poll that is surprising all of these candidates, right? And it's that American parents today of children under the age of 18 are worried that their children will not have as good a lifestyle as they will in their futures. Whether that's true or not, that is actually their anxiety. That's what they're feeling. And I think a lot of the politics of 2016 is feeding into that.
Yep.
And you're going to see the polling about it, and you already hear it, some of the rhetoric, including on both sides, Democrats and Republicans. So I was just curious if you think there's a disconnect of what others are worried about or what you might worry about and what Americans are worried about.
So the good news is that on that issue, a lot of American corporate executives do worry about the same thing. And I mean, I talk to a lot of CEOs. I'll say very much on the record. So Jeff Immelt, who I like and respect a great deal, absolutely is worried about, employment capabilities, ability to drive the United States economy so we don't have a growing inequality gap. I definitely see leaders, certainly Eric Schmidt is very worried about that, and the other Google leaders are. I mean, lots of corporates I talk to are. So there I do see alignment, because they understand that long term, you don't just want to be a global CEO who's offshoring everything. You see the US is the largest economy in the world and also has rule of law, and you really want that economy to be vibrant. You don't want not to be able to sell your stuff. But I think that when you start talking about the other issues we've been talking about, like Americans are worried about ISIS. We're worried about terrorism, right? Where that doesn't come up at all with corporate executives. Corporate executives are worried about Europe, and they're worried about China, and they should be. And those things are much more significant in terms of impact on our economy. Executives are worried about Iran insofar as it affects oil prices, and aside from that, they could basically care less. Some want to invest in Iran as a market, most don't care. Where Americans are much more interested in that deal. It's become a much bigger deal, and clearly the political process is much more aligned to those sorts of knee-jerk fears than they are about the longer-term structural things that are really going to change the nature of the market for us.
Last question before a quick lightning round, and then we'll go to the questions in the audience. To the extent that world capitals are paying attention to the 2016 election, what do they make of the current front-runner of the Republican Party?
Well, I'll tell you
Republican Party, I guess. I mean, today, this week.
Most leaders want to see Hillary. They're comfortable with her. They like, both Hillary and Bill. They've spent time with her. The problems we have with the Clinton Foundation and corruption around that actually has made them more comfortable, because it means that lots of heads of state have still been engaged with the Clintons over the last several years. No, I guess it's funny, but that's actually true. Like, if you're a head of state who is engaged with the Clinton Foundation, whether or not you've given them money, you kind of feel like, oh, these are comfortable guys that I can work with. Interestingly, the Chinese do not want Hillary. They don't like her view on the pivot. They don't like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though she said she doesn't like it more recently. Beforehand, she was one of the architects. They don't like her policy on economic statecraft or concerns about cyber. They really don't want to see her there. Their views on Trump, I get almost no questions from the international audience on Trump at all. They're
not watching cable news.
I think they are watching cable. I think they're aware of it. I just think they understand that our election process is a
crazy.
sham. It's 5. No, it's so. I wish when I first saw him run.
This time?
This time.
Okay.
He didn't run before, did he?
Yeah, he did. He flirted with it.
No, but he never actually ran, did he?
No.
Yeah. So when I first saw him run this time, I thought it was going to be like other times.
Right.
And I was wrong. And I lost $20 in my firm to someone who's really pleased about that. That's not supposed to happen, because I'm supposed to be the chief, political sciences. But I was wrong. I really hoped in my heart that this was satire. Because look, the fact that we have a political process that has increased, where it's so long, there's so much money. I saw the stats in that wonderful piece by Bruni in the New York Times this weekend. $900 million spent on TV ads in the general election last time, 75% of which was spent in 5 states. And you say, wow, the American public has just been completely disenfranchised from this process. And you look at, sort of the role of super PACs, and even Hillary getting on that bandwagon, and who the hell remembers when McCain actually used to not be an establishment guy, but actually was the maverick saying campaign finance reform. All of that is gone. And so I was thinking, you know what? There's no way that, no matter how many zeros are on our campaign, how much money is spent, no matter how long it lasts, that no one is prepared to do anything about it. So maybe if Trump runs and actually takes the lead and spends $1 billion or $2 billion, that maybe he could so shame us that we could actually reform the system. Now, I fear that that is wrong on both sides. We won't reform the system, and we will not be shamed. And furthermore, I don't think that's what he's doing.
And be careful what you wish for.
And be careful what you wish for. But yeah, I think I'm wrong. I think that Trump is just a solipsistic
Well, we should come back
billionaire.
next year when it matters.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I'm going to ask you just 3 quick questions.
Okay.
Any
That's
country
not a
in
lightning
the
round. 3 is a lightning round?
Well,
I'll be
talked
really fast.
longer. Okay.
Okay.
How? Any country you've never been to that you'd like to go to?
Chile.
Never been to Chile?
Shocking, I know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could somebody get him a trip to Chile? Okay, we'll go.
It was Bhutan, but I've been to Bhutan. Chile, you tell you.
Favorite cuisine from around the world?
Italian.
Why do the Japanese like you so much?
Willingness to tell them honestly when I truly disagree with them.
And they accept it.
They love it. Japanese culture's weird that way.
They like that.
Yeah.
We could use a little more of that.
Yeah.
Last book you read?
That would never work in America, right?
No,
Never.
don't tell. No, yeah.
Yeah.
Last book you read?
Is Seven Eyes by Neil Stephenson.
Okay. Is it good?
Fantastic.
Okay. Seven Eyes by Neil Stephenson?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I shouldn't ask that one. Maybe I should. If you were to, would you work for a White House? Like, would you, if a candidate called you today, would you consider joining up?
It's really hard to imagine on both fronts.
If you could be ambassador to any country in the
No.
world? Earlier today, I said I was excited to come to this event with Ian Bremmer, and they said, "Oh, the former ambassador," and I said, "No, the future ambassador." But you know?
When I'm like 85, and can't string a sentence together, sure, but not now. No.
Okay, how'd you meet your wife?
A book party.
Why did you first go to Russia?
I was able.
You were young.
I was 16.
Uh-huh.
I was in college. I started college 15. And a professor was leading a trip to the former Soviet Union. I never left the United States before. I was like, wow, can I go? And he made me convince him, and then I went.
How did your mom deal with your brain?
My mom had panic disorder, and my dad died when I was 4, and she put everything into me and my brother, which was kind of insane. She was very overprotective and pushed a lot, and I love her deeply, and made me everything I am today. But she was kind of crazy. I miss her immensely, but she was kind of crazy. She really, I was clearly going to come out like either this way or no way. There was no other way.
For parents who are anxious about the future of their children, if somebody came to you today and said, "What do you think I should major in?" Like, what are the majors that you would recommend to students today?
More than one. I would tell
Okay.
them not to just do one thing. I would say be dilettantes. That the way I became successful was I'm not the best political scientist in the world. I'm pretty good. I'm certainly not the best observer of markets in the world. In fact, I'm nowhere close to that. But I think I'm absolutely the person that first brought them together because I developed some expertise in both. I think that the way that people, it's really hard to become the top expert in any one thing. It's really interesting to see patterns. And I think there are more and more people with skill sets that need to see patterns, whether it's technical patterns or psychological patterns or what have you. That was what I would tell parents, that get their kids to become more dilettantish.
Ed Snowden, hero or traitor?
Both. I want him in
You have
jail
to
in the
choose?
United States. No. I'm delighted that we learned this. It horrifies me that he went to Russia and China afterwards and Shirley gave that information. If you made me choose between the two, I say traitor. But I think he's both.
And do you think Obama should do a deal and bring him back?
I don't know if I trust the contents of that deal.
I agree. Favorite place to vacation in America?
Nantucket.
And your dog? How'd you find him?
Moose.
Yeah.
He's fantastic.
Yeah.
He's this big. He reminds me of me. He's small but thinks he's large. He's incredibly annoying and persistent, but somewhat lovable at the same time, and I think that's kind of why I like him.
Dogs are the great equalizer, right?
What about you and Jasper? How would you describe that?
Jasper?
Yeah.
What does my husband say? I hope I get this right. It's pretty funny. We'll end on this before I take your questions. It was that, you know how they say that dogs start to look like their owners. And he's like, well, that's a good thing because, he's lean and he's really beautiful, so he looks like you, but he has bad gas like me. So we're like a perfect match. I don't know if you and Anne would agree.
I'm so sorry I asked that question.
As you know, my husband is British and would tell that joke much better.
He
Can
would.
I ask, can you still tell non-PC jokes on the international scene?
Absolutely.
Like, Seinfeld says you can't tell them anymore, like on a college campus, you can't tell a joke about the Chinese or something.
Yeah.
But can you still do that internationally?
You can.
Do you have some good ones? Not about the Chinese, but like,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to ask you to tell them because I know that we can't do that.
I have an incredibly non-PC joke that I have told in audiences smaller than this that I will tell you afterwards if you want. Yes.
Afterward?
Yeah.
All right. I'll hold you to that. And let's see. Do we have microphones? They're all around. So let's start over here with this young lady here in like third row. There you go. Maybe you could tell us your name and where you're from before your question.
Hi, I'm Julie. I wanted to know, you talk about having a coherent, cohesive, proactive approach about America. That's exactly what your book is about. But when you discussed foreign policy earlier, and that the purpose being to avoid alienating our allies, when you talked about Israel and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, that was kind of the opposite of your message. So I'm wondering how you reconcile the importance of America to have a proactive approach with that.
So I think that I'm okay with alienating our allies if we're honest about what we're doing and we let them know. In other words, I'm being a little cute there. The U.S. relationship with Israel is no longer as close as it used to be. And that is for many reasons. Part is because Netanyahu and Obama just don't get along and are ideologically very different. But it's not only that. It's also that the Israelis no longer need Palestinian labor. And they no longer are concerned about the threat of a third intifada. And so there's really very little support in Israel for a two-state solution, even from the left, while that's what the Americans would want. The Iran deal that the Americans want to cut for the geopolitical reasons that I mentioned, but the Israelis oppose it. We should not pretend that everything is exactly the same as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. We have to be honest. There's a lot of interest that the Americans and the Israelis still share. Israel is a democracy. They have rule of law. They have a vibrant, media. Women play an extraordinary role in their society and their economy. They're much better and more freely governed than just about any other country in the region. And we also have a shared interest in working together on things like, cybersecurity vis-a-vis the Iranians, terrorism, all intelligence sharing, you name it. And of course, our military defense producers make a lot of money off of Israel. It's not that we can't be friends, but I think we have to be much more honest. When we pick a strategy, we have to figure out what we're going to do with these allies and how we're going to work with them. And by the way, our allies are not going to be the same forever. Alliances, as interests change, alliances will change. What worries me is that, Britain is the country that we're ostensibly closest to, certainly culturally and institutionally in Europe, and yet Germany is by far the most important. And, Israel's the country that we used to be closest to in the Middle East, and yet Iran and Saudi Arabia are more important. Probably Iran's the most important in many ways. And, Japan is the country we're closest to in Asia, but China's vastly more important. How could that not change your relationships with your allies, and yet we're not actually in any way thinking this through? I think that's a serious problem. And I think our allies are not stupid. They can tell when we're lying, and so can our adversaries. And I think we can't get away with this anymore.
Should we go over here?
Sorry, is this working? Yeah.
Yes.
Richard Davies, I make podcasts. Iran, you said that we should be more honest in our discussion of foreign policy. Are both sides on the Iran deal being dishonest? One saying it's a disaster, the other saying it's a really good deal, when the truth is that what we have to choose is between what we would have without a deal, which is terrible, and with a deal, which is not very good.
That's a great question. I'll answer it quickly. I don't think the choice is between what we have with this and the absence of a deal. I think the choice was the deal that we signed, or it was a continued interim deal with longer negotiations. That's an uninteresting conversation. It doesn't really make Fox or MSNBC very excited. It's not going to drive a lot of eyeballs. But that's the reality. And I happen to think we probably could have gotten a slightly better deal if we had blown through a fourth deadline as opposed to just the first three. I think we could have worked a little harder. We could have gotten something that was maybe 10 or 20% better. I'm not certain of that, but I would have tried if I was in that situation. Having said that, Kerry was in there for longer than any Secretary of State in any international effort since George Shultz in 1983. The guy was exhausted. And when you're doing that kind of monomaniacally, you kind of lose a little bit of focus. And all those guys are in that room, and you got to be a little empathetic to that too. So I think that's the answer.
Someone in the middle here? Maybe up here? Any of these fine gentlemen?
Thanks a lot. That's a terrific conversation. As an ex-Soviet, I was very much interested in your comment about going to the Soviet Union and saying, oh, gee, our ideas won. But on the other hand, on the flip side of it, America and the West never really hesitated to bash Soviet ideas, or during the war with the Nazis to bash Nazi ideas. And in contrast to the war of, what many call Islamofascism, we kind of limit ourselves to chewing this innocent Islam is a peaceful religion, and therefore they pervert Islam and don't do it. And while in fact Islam and their views on Islam are as vulnerable as was Nazism or communism. And I'm just wondering, why are we censor ourselves, and why can't we go all the way talking openly, talking honestly about the ideology behind all this, and really debunking it and saying, you guys are morons, basically.
Do you understand that?
I certainly do.
Or
Yeah.
ISIS.
No, it's such a hard question, sir. And by the way, I have to say, I'm having a lot of fun in this conversation. I do have to say that. So thank you, and thank you. I don't like the fact that we seem to refuse to talk about radical Islam as a part of the problem. That certainly the Obama administration has taken a very active sense that they don't want to label things as being radical Islam in a way that the French are very happy to. Now France has had a lot of problems with doing that, of course, because they have alienated a large part of their domestic population, some 8%, and they've made the Front National over 30% popular in the country. Now, we could get away with it without that problem because, Muslims are a much smaller percentage of our population. They're largely integrated in American society. But I would not, the danger is, of course, that you start down that slope and you don't just demonize radical Islam and its manifestations, particularly in Wahhabism, but you radicalize and you demonize all Islam. Because, when I see Shia, I don't see a lot of Shia support for the visceral terrorist organizations around the world. I see a lot of it in certain strands of Sunniism. That's interesting. Most people that talk about Islamofascism don't make that distinction. That worries me. So, and also, I certainly think, if you ask me what is causing the terrorism that we have today, I think radical Islam is a significant part. Do I think radical Islam is the biggest piece? Nope. I think it's a lot of things. I can look at the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I can look at colonialism. You want to go back. In Syria, I'd look at climate change. I saw that they had massive and unprecedented droughts in Syria, that all of the farmers no longer had any water to grow their feedstock, which meant that they had to slaughter their livestock. They were incredibly angry at subsistence living. They rioted in homes 4 years ago. Assad massacred them. Then we had the war. The country fell apart. That created space for radical Islam with ISIS as well as Al-Qaeda and other offshoots to emerge. Nobody's telling that story. I haven't heard Obama once talk about the impact of climate change on the Syrian war. Maybe he hasn't
Governor O'Malley
missed
did.
it. Did he?
Governor O'Malley did.
He did. Oh,
he might be your guy.
Yeah, he could be my guy. Unlikely, but nonetheless. But it's so. I guess all I'm saying is I take your point, but I react to it in a little strongly because I worry about what it means to only focus on that point.
Right. Do we have time for more, Alice? Yeah. Okay. Should we go back over on this side?
Should I be faster?
Well, it depends on how many questions you want to answer.
I don't know.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm a student at NYU. You talked basically about every region in the world but Latin America.
I thought of that after I said Africa, and then I'm like, once again, Latin America is not getting enough attention. My fault. I should have brought it up.
I actually would like to hear about your views about Latin America to the U.S. The Chinese are certainly paying a lot of attention in the region. So what do you think about this?
Did you see that President Lula pulled a Huckabee today? You see that? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah, Lula, who is now being investigated for corruption with this car wash scandal in Petrobras, came out today and said that basically the investigators against him are like Nazis going after the Jews. This is the refuge of the last chance, right? Is saying that you're. It's horrible. I'm glad you did Africa because frequently Africa is the place that doesn't get any attention, and Latin America will. Obviously, we care about it. We don't spend as much attention. Cuba was a big win. We love to see that. It's only 50 years late, but nonetheless, it's coming, right? No, because how do you get rid of a regime? Isolate them? No. Invest in them? Yes. You think that Cuba can handle 5 years of Starbucks? No way. I'm going to go and destroy that country with my consumption habits. I promise you, we're all going to do that. It's going to be exciting. I think that Brazil's the big economy. The big problem with Brazil is that they're stuck in a lousy neighborhood. I mean, they're members of the BRICS. They're members of the Mercosur. They're the best house in a lousy block, and that's not where you want to be. They need to be a part of NAFTA. They need to be a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think a winning strategy on foreign policy for presidential candidates that want to say something really differentiated is talk about your big Brazil strategy, because there's real opportunity for the Americans there, especially as they're hurting economically and they need some options. It's not like Venezuela is going to help them at all. And they see themselves as competitive with the Chinese. I can talk about Mexico, but I got to tell you, 90% of Mexico's trade's with the U.S. So when I went down there last and I had the Minister of Finance saying, we've got more free trade agreements than any other country in the world, I'm like, that's fantastic. Have fun with those FTAs if the American economy implodes, right? So they do. They're very talented. They're hugely technocratic. They've got great rule of law, the great business sense, but they're completely stuck to the United States. They don't really get to hedge that. And so ultimately, I don't spend much time on Mexico.
All right, over here. We come up front, maybe? Okay.
Okay, I'll sneak in anyway. So I really enjoyed the book, and I wanted to ask about some of your commentary about the situation inside the United States. You're mostly focused on foreign policy, but in the course of making your point, you make some pretty strong statements about the state of affairs inside the country. You've repeated or built on some of that stuff tonight, and I think these kind of statements are very common, but the long-term trajectory of what that could mean often goes pretty much unexplored. You seem to be a guy who would be well-placed for that. So I'm curious if you have any expectations. Do you expect the two-party political system to remain intact as is through your lifetime? Thank you.
You have a view on that?
I don't see an attractive alternative at the moment because I don't know what that would stand for or what it means. I mean, I'm a little bit of a practical realist at this point when somebody, like if I saw my friends this weekend and they don't want Hillary to win, right? So they'll say, she's not going to win, right? And I'm like, no, she's likely to win. And they're like, oh, no, how can you say that? I'm like, look, let's just look at the way that it worked, the way that it is set up, and it is the system that we have. So you go to the election with the system you have, not the system you want. And that is, if you have to get to 270 electoral votes, and you take California and New York off the table, then a Republican has to pretty much win everything else, except for like your Vermonts and your blue wall up here in New England. And a Republican has to win Ohio, Florida, and now Virginia. So it's not impossible. And right now, when there are 17 candidates, it's hard to see a path. But that's going to be very difficult. So then Trump and a few others in the past have said, well, I'm going to create a third party, but there's not yet a desire for it. It could be coming. For the first time ever, neither Republicans or Democrats have a majority of support in the electorate. So 40% of people say they're independent. They don't mean independent in terms of the way Superpower lays it out, but independent meaning that they don't like labels. They want to be able to choose. They're like, I don't like this, I don't like that. But when it comes to a primary system, when you're electing two nominees, that's the system that we have at the moment. It is possible. Let's just play out a scenario. Let's say Donald Trump decides, I'm going to go for an independent party. I'm going for a third party, Neither, well, I think Obama did in 2012, but it's very hard to get actually over 50% of the popular vote. Now, if there's a third party, even my dog Jasper can do that math. It doesn't work out. Could you get 35% as a third party today? It's not out of the question. So when you say in my lifetime, there might be a change in the system. I think the money issue, I don't know how you fix it, but when you have the millionaires mad that the billionaires have crowded them out, and you think about Reince Priebus, who is the head of the RNC, this is a guy who has I think one of the hardest jobs. So 50% of the people that donate to the Republican National Committee on any given year give $25,000 a year or more, or maybe it's $50,000 a year or more, something like that. The other 50% give $25 or less. Those two groups don't agree on anything. And he's trying to build this big tent and bring people together while there's 17 candidates all running against each other. Kind of impossible. In the meantime, the Democrats are very, very unified. They march in a group. The problem for them, I think, in the future is that they have a very, very limited bench. And if you look at Ohio and Florida, there is no Democratic vice presidential ringer for Hillary Clinton in those two particular states. The Republicans actually have two very good ones, three possibly good ones, maybe four, actually, off the top of my head. So there is a bench. So how does that play out in my lifetime? I'm not exactly sure. But anyway.
The only thing, that's a much more coherent answer than I would have given to that question. I will say, no, I'm not domestic. But one thing that I find really interesting is that I think that we are going to see much more decentralization of power in the United States going forward. I think as we see Washington doing less and less, we're going to see states and cities are going to do so much more. And that will weaken the power of the American government in Washington. It may well change the way money ends up flowing in terms of elections and lobbying and all the rest. I don't think that's bad. I think that's resilient. And whether you're talking about, sort of same-sex marriage, or you're talking about energy policy and the energy revolution, or just about anything that's happened in the last 10 years, even the climate, right? All of this stuff, cafe standards, the rest, being driven by individual states. More fragmentation of the global environment probably means that smaller communities have a more effective hold on governance. The Chinese are the antithesis of that, and we will see long-term if it works out.
But and the last thing on that, we have maybe a question up here in the front row here, if we could get that one ready. I would just add that 69 of 99, so 69 of 99 state legislatures are run by Republicans. The 32 of the governorships are Republicans and safe. So there is, actually, when people say there's too much uniformity, there actually is a lot of diversity, and the Republicans have been running the tables on that, and I think that for the near future they will. After the census changes in 2020, I think that the realignment in the Congress will change, and I think it will be harder for Republicans, at least of today's Republicans, to hold the House. But they will up until then. Did you have a question here? Up here in the front row.
Let me try and tie together the last discussion you had with the one that followed earlier, mostly on foreign affairs. Ian, if you, including the current presidential candidates, but not solely including them, looking beyond them, do you see anyone who is a realistic possibility to be an American president who has the leadership qualities and intelligence that you think are necessary to lead us in a global world?
I'll go through a few that I think have possibilities, both of the present candidates and those that don't. And again, recognizing that this is very early days, and I don't have a lot to say as a consequence. But by far, the one candidate who has the most foreign policy experience, of course, is Hillary when she was Secretary of State. When she was Secretary of State, she actually had a very coherent worldview. She was very much a money baller. She basically said, pivot to Asia, focus on that. The Chinese are the biggest concern. The Asian allies really want more America. Let's give it to them, militarily, economically, and the rest. Focus on a strategy of economic statecraft, because the Americans don't do industrial policy, the Chinese do. We have to deal with that. Also, don't lecture the Chinese on human rights. They're your banker. It's not going to work very well. Focus on what you can do. Now, those things all worked reasonably well. The Russia reset was also part of Moneyball. That failed, but you can understand why she wanted to do it. Libya, we're blamed for Libya, Hillary's blamed for Libya, but actually Libya, the blame for Libya should be on the French, should be on the Gulf states. They were the ones that desperately wanted to go. And the Americans said, we're only going to do it, last resort, tiny amount of military effort. You guys have to take the lead. You want to fix it, you fix it. So the Americans didn't pay for anything in Libya. It fell apart. I don't see why the Americans should take the blame for that. But nonetheless, right? So I think that Hillary, clearly she has the competence. And clearly when she was Secretary of State, she showed that she could put together a coherent worldview. Having said that, she backed away from a bunch of that as candidate. And when she was Secretary of State, the Clinton Inc. didn't play much of a role. It largely left her alone, and she did a fairly technocratic job. As president, I am much more concerned that Clinton Inc. will play a much greater role. She will be much more machined, and I'm not sure that she's going to stand. So I have to hedge those things. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn on Hillary right now, frankly. I don't think she'd be a disaster. Again, I like in the same way that I thought that Larry Summers would have been ultimately, you know, a good person to have as Secretary of Treasury, because when you travel outside the U.S., the contacts, the network, the connections, the respect he had was immense, and I think that matters. Where domestically, the guy was so polarizing and such a problem. So I might have a slightly different view than a lot of the typical responses you get on Hillary or on someone like Larry. Scott Walker read the book, right? Loved it, knows nothing about foreign policy, admits it, has said he needs to get up the curve, wants to do the reading, has had his team asking as many questions as possible. I don't know if he's going to be any good, but I like that orientation, personally. You know, I got to tell you, I mean, of all of the people that have run recently, and I'm very biased, I adored John Huntsman. I adored John Huntsman. He was, first of all, he was a really credible ambassador to China. He speaks the language pretty fluently. He was deputy U.S. trade rep. So not only does he know diplomacy and does he know the most important part of the world for the U.S., he understands business, right? He did a good job running Utah. When he won as governor, he actually created a team of rivals. He took his opposition that he destroyed, he brought them all in to help govern Utah. The guy also has 7 kids, and he seems upbeat. I don't know how you do that, right? So, I mean, he clearly had absolutely no chance of winning, and he's about as purple as you get as a candidate, so it's probably not surprising that I like him. But I think he'd be a damn good president personally, and that's about, you know, that doesn't get you very much. But nonetheless, it's what I think.
We have one last question, and you have up here? Front. Sure.
So my name is Fiston. Actually, I come from International Rescue Committee. My question is about Iran. Speak up. My question is about Iran. I'm not sure. I don't understand what your position is in Iran, especially in a nuclear standpoint. You said that the nuclear standpoint, you give it 3% if you were to say
3 out of 10.
3 out of 10.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you are not giving it what will be your good deal sense. Like you didn't give us, what is a good deal? Are you implying that Iran to dismantle the entire nuclear program? Are you, what exactly your good
Yeah,
deal
so
standard?
a couple things. Great question. Number one, to be clear, I would vote for this deal. I support this deal. It's close, but I support it because the geopolitics being particularly good outweigh the somewhat negative nuclear deal. And also because, as I said, I don't think nukes matter quite as much as cyber. So I put less, the fact that I say it's a 3 and that everyone's talking about the nuclear deal, I happen to discount that. What are the things that would have made, I don't think we could have gotten a 7. I think we could have gotten a 5. So how would we have gotten a 5? A couple things. As I said, more time and forcing the Iranians back to the table, whittling down over time over 3 issues. One, on the ability to get, well, 2 real issues. One is I really don't like the 24-day waiting period on inspections. And I don't like the back and forth if they then say no, which can give you almost another 24. That's too long. I would have pushed them down on that. I would have tried to make that a week at most. I would have really wanted much more access, especially to military sites, and I would have been willing to negotiate longer and harder for that. The other thing is that a week before the deal was done, the Russians publicly broke from us on the arms embargo and said that they wanted the arms embargo off the first day, which, and that's because the Russians saw that we were a little weak. They saw that we really wanted the deal done. We were really close, and they thought they'd float something that would help them economically. And we, by God, let them get away with it. We actually backed down and said, okay, well, we're not going to let it be the first day, but we'll actually, over 5 years and 8 years, we'll actually reduce and then remove the arms embargo. I would have said no way to that. So for me, if we could have gotten those two things, I'd put this deal at a 5. Not a 10, but a 5's okay. See, what I don't like about the nuclear deal right now is, you're supposed to say that if it's a good deal, that means that both sides are equally unhappy. The Iranians are actually happier with what they've gotten in the nuclear deal right now than the Americans are. I don't actually like that. I think we could have done better. It was undermined. It was undermined by the fact that we had a lot of people that wanted to deal more than we do and faster than we do, were willing to give more away. I think we could have gotten a little more. But I will tell you, again, I criticized Kerry hard on Russia-Ukraine. I have criticized him a lot on Syria. I applaud Kerry's work on Iran. On balance, I think that this was not easy to do. He built a strong relationship with the Iranian foreign minister. He built a reasonable channel, even indirectly, to the supreme leader. Not many people could have done that. I give him credit for that.
And thank you, sir, because you brought us full circle back to Iran. So Ian Bremmer, everyone, author of Superpower.
Dana Perino, Fox the
Thank
Five.
you.
Always have the last word, right? Thank you both. I promised everybody a sparkling and stimulating evening. I think this was one of the best. Thank you so much for being with us.